All right, let's look a little bit at just kind of daily life and customs of the Puritans. Here we see that activities like gambling or certain games would be considered sinful for the Puritans, namely because it took away from time when they felt they should be working and industrious. They didn't formally celebrate Christmas in a big, elaborate way. They felt that was excessive, and even that kind of goes to their back to those differences they have with the Anglican and Catholic Church of that level of excess and fanciness is not how they interpreted the New Testament of the Bible. And along with that idea of keeping everyone on the same page, people's behavior was really closely monitored. Um, there would be patrols. Someone would know if you were showing up at church or you had not been to church. So, kind of being in people's business was something encouraged rather than seen as a negative. I think it's important that we think about the role of children in this community and just that it's very, very different than how we live today. That idea that of children being seen and not heard was part of this life, and maybe even more so for young girls than boys who would be receiving like a full education, and girls would not be. Cursing at your parents was considered like a serious crime that you could be punished for. The average family was large, and some of this is because you know the difficulties of this life, and we don't have the medicines that we have now. So the mortality rate was very different than today, and many in a large family would not survive. However, sometimes there are some myths that the Puritans were all strict and no fun, and we hear that word. Someone's acting puritanical, often to describe someone being very serious and strict and no fun. And they were a community that did celebrate and work together. You can see from that book on the right, there were games and play. They did drink wine. There were taverns. Now, respected people in the community wouldn't be hanging out at them. It would be the ne'er-do-wells that would be at the taverns. It's also a myth that they just wore these black and white costumes that we see a lot. Um, their clothes by no means were fancy, but they did wear bright colors. I'm not sure about that picture on the left, the woman in the brown. That might be a bit later on. That seems a little too fancy. But they did wear many bright colors and were not just limited to a black and white wardrobe. And they were passionate people that did have celebrations. That little picture on the right just cracked me up. That's from contemporary times, someone throwing a kind of ironic Puritan party. But anyway, it's a myth that they were just serious, serious all the time, and there was no fun in their lives. And I think what's most notable, and what historians have written a lot about, is that for all the flaws, and a big one that we're about to read about in the play The Crucible, they made it. They survived. A lot of other groups that came over, especially those that were motivated for profit, that came here to make a quick buck and then go back to England or make a fortune. Many of those communities died, and much has been written about. Perhaps one of the reasons this community was able to survive is because they were so strict and hardworking, and because they had this common belief that held them together. And it wasn't just about money or some other more shallow purpose. Take a second and read this excerpt from Governor John Winthrop, because I think this is quite a lovely and beautiful philosophy that was also part of the Puritan spirit. There were Puritan deaths from Native American attacks when the Puritans first came here, and they're invading the land, taking over the land that the Native Americans had lived on. So of course that caused conflict. There really wasn't a kumbaya love fest of bringing the Native Americans into the Puritan culture, or even attempts to bring them into the Puritan faith. And now that I look at it, that word snobbery is really is not strong enough. It's really racism when we think about it, that often the Puritans were just not seeing the Native Americans really as human beings. We're seeing them as inferior, and that is a reason they're not bringing them into the fold. There was not a lot of movement and exploration beyond their villages into the wilderness. One, because of Native Americans, that could be dangerous. But two, a belief, even a religious-based belief, seeing the wilderness as a place where the devil was present, that it would be very dangerous for those reasons to venture out into the wilderness. This is a map of Salem Village during the time in which the play is set. We can see that Salem's name comes from Jerusalem. And yeah, take a second and look at this map. So the play we are about to read is based on real events that Arthur Miller, the playwright, studied, the Salem witch trials. In 1692, two girls began having what were described as fits, and they were diagnosed as being victims of witchcraft. It's important to note that a belief in witchcraft, this was not something new for the Puritans, and certainly witches had been tried and burned in Europe already in the past. Witchcraft in England, and the Puritans are still kind of under obviously the control of England, was believed to be a crime against the state or a crime against country, which is why the punishment was hanging. This also goes to the Puritans' belief about Satan, and Satan kind of actively seeking out citizens. Check out this quote from Nathaniel Ward, a Puritan clergyman, and see what he is trying to say, and also see who is considered protected from Satan in their eyes. So the two girls that appeared to be bewitched were urged to name who was responsible, who was bewitching them. And they named two very unpopular women in the town, two older, unmarried women who were already kind of on the outs in the community. And one thing we will see in the play was, and this really happened with the witch trials, that when someone was accused, one way they could escape death, they might still go to prison, was one, to confess that they were under the powers of Satan, or that they had been bewitched, and then to name names who had actually bewitched them. And so this is what happened in Salem Village. So ministers and leaders, they decided, we are getting rid of all the witches in Salem. They made it their plan to rid the community of witchcraft. And within 10 months, 150 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem. I was just reading that the youngest accused was 4 years old. The oldest was, I think, someone in their 90s. Even 2 dogs were accused of witchcraft. 19 people were hanged for the crime of witchcraft, and 1 person was pressed to death, and we'll learn more about that in the play. So why? How did this happen? This was one thing that Arthur Miller was very interested in, and he did a lot of research. He read everything he could get his hands on about the Salem witch trials and about the community, trying to figure out how did this hysteria take over this town. And Arthur Miller was also interested in, do we still metaphorically hunt for witches in American society? There was something going on in his time period that we'll be learning about, where he saw a great correlation between the hysteria in the 1950s to what happened in Salem. At any time, you can just Google witch hunt, and that's a term that we use often now for a process that is kind of driven by hysteria. And that's really an allusion, when we see that term in print, often to the Salem witch trials. This is just an interesting fact that, it's like, why are we reading this play? Why do millions of high school students read this play? Even though it was first performed in 1953, it continues to speak to us and to people all over the world, as you'll see from this figure that it's estimated that every week somewhere in the world people are performing the play The Crucible. And that's really the test of a great work of literature, that it continues to have something to say to us, that its themes are still relevant to us, despite the fact it was written many years ago.